All right, so women and society in the 18th century. During the last course, last term, when I was looking at the 16th and 17th centuries, I gave quite a lot of importance to women in the course. One reason, because quite often they don't get much mention in history books and so on. Another reason, because you are nearly all women. Okay, there are only one or two men in these lecture classes usually. Okay, so but I think it's interesting for everybody to see how that situation came about, because 200 years ago, in a university lecture hall, in almost anywhere, there would be no women at all. Right? Now you're the majority here. Okay, how did that happen? How did that change? Well, that's something that's the seeds of that change are in the 18th and especially the 19th century. So let's have a look and see how things are developing in the 18th century. We've talked about the British Empire. We've talked about the Industrial Revolution. Behind the Industrial Revolution lies, of course, science and scientific thinking. If it wasn't for scientific thinking replacing the kind of magical religious thinking that people had to a fair extent before that, if it hadn't been for the development of scientific thinking, there would have been no Industrial Revolution. So the change from the kind of religious-focused, magical view of the world to the practical, logical view of the world is called the Enlightenment. So the Enlightenment, this is something that we need to take a little bit of a look at. It really gets going, or it has its beginnings in the late 16th century, with things moving slowly and steadily towards scientific rationalism. You're getting a slow but steady development of the idea we should be able to test this. We should be able to do experiments and get reliable results. So the idea of science was beginning to get going. You got Francis Bacon in the late 16th century. He's often considered to be the father of modern science, and he presents a scientific method about how you test things, if you can repeat that experiment and get the same result, it will show that there is a reliable connection. So the whole idea of scientific method is developing in the late 16th century. You get physicians, by that I mean doctors really, William Gilbert, William Harvey, and they're developing the understanding of the human body. They didn't know, for example, in the Tusagidae in the Middle Ages, they didn't know that the blood flowed around the body and that the heart was pumping blood around the body. They didn't even know that. Okay? They didn't really understand how the body worked. So you get people starting to examine the human body from a scientific point of view and saying, wait a minute, the blood is actually being carried away from the heart here, and it's being carried back to the heart here. The heart is beating, and the heartbeat is driving the blood around the body. And that's the sort of thing that they were discovering in those days. And then you get modern chemistry. Again, a lot of this is actually English, as you know. Some of it's going on in Europe as well, but so many English or British or Scottish as well, people are starting to develop this idea of a scientific method. And the Royal Society started in 1660 and became a focal point for scientific thinking and academic papers and so on. It established a standard. So all of this is going on before the 18th century even gets started. And then we get the Royal Observatory. Britain comes into the lead of those countries that are mapping the skies. getting huge telescopes, or, well, it's not so huge, but developing ever bigger telescopes to be able to understand, how do the stars move? How do the planets move? What makes them move like that? What's their relationship to our planet? So they start calculating. They already knew that the world was round. They already knew that our planet goes around the sun, but they didn't quite understand that well, we still don't understand everything that's out there, okay? So they were developing maps of the sky, trying to find out, this star must be further away than this one because, well, through our telescope we can see, so they're starting to see the depth of the sky. So again, that's another area where Britain, or England and Britain, are developing the scientific method. And the laws of motion, the law of gravity, it's said that Isaac Newton was in his garden one afternoon and an apple fell from a tree and hit him on the head. He thought, gravity. Okay, so these sorts of things, that every object has its gravity. It pulls other objects towards it, that there's attraction that physical objects have for each other. So again, something that hadn't really been thought about before. So you can see English and British scientists even before the 18th century developing the scientific method. And all of these are kind of the beginnings of the idea of the Enlightenment, or the Age of Reason, where instead of having a kind of magical view of reality, people expect things to be scientific, logical. They want to see things following logical patterns. And once you've got those logical patterns, machinery and that kind of technology follow more or less inevitably. They naturally are a result. So if we think about the early modern period, there was a lot of, I've called it magical so far. Another word to use would be superstitious, okay, Meijing. All right, superstition was a typical reaction to the world. One of the best examples would be witches. The last witch was actually hanged in the 18th century in 1729. In most of Europe, witches were burned. In Britain, they were hanged. In England, they were hanged. And a few years later, in 1735, you got an extraordinary new law. All through the 16th century, the 17th century, and sonomai chusei didai, the crime was to be a witch. That was the crime. So somebody will point their finger and say, you're a witch. And that's it. You're finished, more or less. Or you'll be very lucky to escape after that. So all anybody had to do is just point a finger and say, you're witches. You die. Okay? Or the authorities would go, is this true? Is this true? You know, they do tests. One of the tests was to stick a needle into the body, and if blood didn't come out, they'd say you were a witch. But the witch hunters knew which parts of the body did not have blood in them. Okay, because although they didn't know about veins pushing the blood around the body, they knew that some parts of the body you could put it in and there was not going to be no blood there. So they could more or less guarantee that they could stick a needle in, but blood won't come out from that particular place because there are no veins there. Nasty. They didn't understand why. That understanding came during this period, but they knew that they could do it. But you see, the big change that happens in the 18th century is the crime is no longer to be accused of being a witch. The crime is no longer to be a witch. The crime is the person who says you are a witch. Why? Because witches don't exist. Okay? The 18th century takes a new attitude. There are no witches. Everybody's just an ordinary human being. Wake up, for God's sake. Stop being so stupid and superstitious. All right? So the crime now is to say that somebody is a witch. Even to say, me, I am a witch, would be a crime. Okay, so saying that you are a witch would be a crime because there are no witches. Accusing somebody else of being a witch would also be a crime because there are no such thing. There is no such thing as witches. Okay, sorry, I sound like Uncle Vernon in Harry Potter. There's no such thing as magic. But you know, is there such a thing as magic? I don't know, but certainly we shouldn't be burning people or hanging people saying that they are witches. Okay, not in a rational, reasonable world. All right, and that is a good sign of how things were changing. That in the 18th century, they woke up and realized there are no witches. The only crime is accusing other people of being witches or pretending to be a witch yourself. So scientific inquiry was developing alongside the decline of superstitious thinking. And the world stops being a place where people think, you know, I'm just here on my way to death, on my way to heaven or hell. The world starts being a place where political issues, the economy, okay, the banking system and everything like that, these things are starting to become more important in people's thinking than religious thinking. So society is becoming more like the society we have today. There's still discrimination against Catholics, but not so much because of their religion, mostly because of the political fear, you know, like this fear that maybe this son will become king, maybe there'll be a revolution and Catholics will try to take control. So the discrimination against Catholics was more political than because they think differently. Okay? They can think what they like, we don't really care very much anymore. The world is no longer a place where we burn each other because we think differently from each other. If they want to think like that, they can. The only danger is we don't want them trying to have a revolution. We don't want them trying to take control. Okay, so there was discrimination, but not so much because of their religious beliefs, more for political reasons. So you're entering a world of coffee shops and banks and middle class growing stronger, consumerism and trade. You know, we saw how the whole British Empire was based on trade and markets, development of technology and all of those things. It's much more like our world. The early modern period, if you went back to the 17th century, the 16th century, you would feel, I don't understand this world. I don't understand the way these people think. All right, they live a very different life from my life. But if you went back to the 18th century, you'd go into the bank and you'd get money and you'd go to the shop and you'd buy things and you'd go to the coffee shop and read the newspaper. And so many things would be rather similar to the world that you have today in terms of the way that people were thinking. Some things will be different, okay? But it's much closer to our modern world. If you look at 18th century London, it's already beginning to look like a sort of modern city. The buildings, the streets. Okay, this is another view of the same street. Well, when it came to witchcraft, a few of those who were accused of being witches were men, but the majority were women, which brings me to my topic for today, women in this society, how that's connected with this idea of the Enlightenment. The fact that people are stopping believing in witchcraft also shows that they're changing their way of thinking about women. You see, one of the reasons that they had this, huge prejudice, this idea that women especially were ijiwaru and witches, seisho kara kimashita kangai desu. Okay, it's in the Bible. It's Eve who gives Adam the apple to eat. Okay, so they're beginning to think, well, maybe that is not such an important point. So during the 17th century, men also are feeling quite threatened by women. There's this feeling, oh, a woman, oh, she could be a danger to me. The easiest way to go to hell is through a woman. Just like Eve gave Adam the apple. A woman will take me to hell if I'm tricked by her. That's what women do. That's what you all do. You trick men to get them to go to hell. You are, or Akuma no Tetsudai-sama, half of you. Some of you are okay. I hope to God I find the right one. This is 17世紀の考え方. Okay, they're really kind of frightened of women. Okay, because women are seen as being kind of devil's servants by a lot of people. They have this fear of women. The 18th century is starting to be more, kind of a little bit more normal about that. So they kind of shinpai, the sense of anxiety, the stress that men felt over women was becoming less. The 16th century also had martyrs, women who died. They were burned for their religion. They were very brave. And men felt stress. I couldn't die like that. How did they do it? They're only women. And I'm supposed to be a man. Okay? I'm not as strong as those women. So again, they felt kind of, women are a threat. Either the very good ones, they're a threat because I can't be as good as that, I can't be as brave as that. And the very bad ones, they're a threat because they're going to take me to hell. Women, okay, a problem for the 17th century psychology. But in the 18th century, men are developing empires, men are fighting wars, men are being men again. Okay, and they are developing trading things. It's a time of opportunity, and in that kind of environment, men are feeling superior again. I'm not saying this is true of everybody, but this is a general pattern. 17th century anxiety, 18th century confidence of the men in the society. So it's a time when through fighting wars and building empires and exploring other countries and developing trading, it's a time of opportunity for men to show their kind of masculine heroism. But by contrast, in this context, a lot of women were pushed into a very narrow kind of life, where they were like the housekeeper, they were forced into the kind of narrow position of looking after the man. The man's the hero, the woman is the person who kind of gives him his breakfast and looks after him. So, of course, poor people, as we saw last week, whether they were men or women, were having a very hard time. And we've talked about the problems of alcoholism and violence and cultural deprivation. We talked about all of this last week as the population moved from the countryside into the towns and cities. I'll go over some of that ground a little bit again, just to remind you. We saw last week the problems of alcohol in the big cities. You notice how the picture is very much focusing on the woman and her baby. All right, there's quite a big focus on the woman's role here. The woman has to take responsibility. She has to look after the children. That's her job. We talked last week also about the London Foundling Hospital. I didn't give you all the details, but here are a few more details about it. In 20 years, in the first 20 years of its life, that hospital took in more than 16,000 babies. And most of them were the parents never came to look for them. Only about one time in 100 did the parents ever come back to try to find their child. So 16,000 children at that time. That's a lot of children whose mothers couldn't raise them, all right? There's a lot of mothers who, for some reason, could not take on their responsibility. And we saw this kind of thing, these sad cases, a little piece of dress. This one especially says, please take care of her, she will be collected. But we don't know if she ever was. Was she one of the 1 in 100 that was collected? We don't know. So it says take particular care. The child will be called for again. The parent will come and collect the child. But most of them were never collected. I wanted to correct a little bit something I said last week, because I said last week that 75% died before the age of 2, and that was true in some places in some years. The average for the whole city of London was 20%, which is still pretty bad. Okay? But in the worst parts of London, in the worst years, it was as high as 74%, I think I said last week. So I just wanted to make clear, I got it a little bit wrong because I was suggesting that that was true over the whole of London. I realized later that wasn't quite right. It was just in the worst places of London during the worst years. But the average during that period was about 20% dying, which is still pretty bad. Time for a funny animation. In the workhouses, of course, it was even higher, and even in the middle of the I put the 1850s. I think that I can't. Is that I think it should be the 1750s. Okay, but I'm not sure. Okay, I'll check that for you for next week. But we've got 90% of children dying in workhouses. I think that must be the 1750s, not the 1850s. Okay, by the Victorian period, conditions were getting better. So I think that's probably a mistake there. I'll change it if so. I'm going to be looking today more at the middle class and higher class women. Their lives were not filled with that kind of hardship where they were so stressed that they couldn't look after their own children. But they still had a very limited role in 18th century society. And it's these more privileged women that I'm going to turn to today, these middle class, upper class women. I'm going to focus on them. Basically, their education was just a preparation for what was called coming out. Coming out was something that happened when you were about 18 years old. You would be introduced to society. Before you were 18 years old, you were kept in the house. You went to school, but you didn't have much contact with society. At the age of about 18, you would be presented to society. You would go to parties. You would go to dances. Your parents would be there, all right? And they'd be introducing you to rich young men and trying to get you married to a nice rich young man, all right? So your education was to prepare you to be suitable for that situation. You should be able to play the piano, for example. Maybe not too well, but reasonably. If you could sing, it would help. You have to carry your body nicely. You have to have good manners. All right, so that was a woman's education, preparing her for meeting a young man that she would marry. Parties and so forth, the hot springs in cities like Bath, those kinds of occasions. All right, you'd be presented into society. And typically your day would begin with your toilet. That did not mean, toilet like we use it now. It meant the place where you would wash and dress and apply your makeup. And a lot of attention would go to this. Even the men spent a long time, the high-class men spent a long time dressing up in those days. Appearance was very important. So this is a typical example. The servant is helping the high-class young lady to get dressed. She's tying on a garment that will keep her body shape. Okay, it's called a girdle. Tying on a garment that keeps her body shape nice and sort of. Even if she wants to walk like this, she can't. The girdle keeps her like this. She's kind of imprisoned in her clothes because they're tied very tightly. Well, I think you might be able to see. No, maybe. Okay, I think I show some pictures of that later on, how tightly they would be tied and so on. And her social calendar would be the sort of central part of her life. She would have servants to do all the practical stuff if she was rich, and her life would be playing card games and meeting people for tea, and very little kind of intellectual activity, very little for the brain, just sort of very simple stuff. Okay, playing card games would be typical, and they would play these games for hours, and then they would find that, you know, they would go and drink some tea somewhere, and then they would have a little party, and then they would. That was their lives. That's what they had. Pretty limiting, really. There were various entertainments like the opera, the theatre, dinner parties, dance parties, tea parties, okay, and that was what people's lives were, especially for the women. It was just kind of one little entertainment after another. Sometimes they would be the hostess, they would have to prepare for the other guests. Very often they would be the guests, and that would be the main activity in their lives. But what are women supposed to do when they think, wait a minute, you know, I've got a brain in my head. I'm not stupid. I don't want to play cards all day. I've got things that I want to think about and talk about, and I'm interested in things, not just small chat. Okay, what am I supposed to do? So there were people who wanted more out of life than just tea parties and card games, but the society wasn't really giving them much choice. So here is an example, okay? Artistic, musical, cultural, educated women. It wasn't all that easy to get that kind of education for a woman, but if you're, for example, if you were in a high-class family and your brothers were getting that kind of education, you'd be talking to your brothers, okay? Or if your husband was like that and he was an open-minded kind of person, he'd teach you things that he knew. So there was a small but growing number of women who had that kind of cultural background. And the question for them was, what are we supposed to do? We don't just want to be playing card games all day. We've got a little bit more that we want to have happening in our lives. And so a group of them got together and started something called the Blue Stockings Society. Now, blue stocking has come to have a little bit of a sort of negative meaning. It's supposed to, in our modern use, people say, oh, she's a bit of a blue stocking. It means she's an academic person. She's not really very interesting. She's just a rather boring kind of academic type of woman. Okay. Possibly interested in politics or something like that, but you can't really have fun with her. Okay, so these women, they were saying, we don't just want to have fun, we want to have something else. It doesn't mean we don't want fun, but we want to have something else as well. But the modern way of understanding blue stockings is they're no fun. They're kind of rather boring academic women. I think the reality in the 18th century was rather different. I think these probably were quite an exciting group of women. Most of the members were from the higher classes. One or two had somehow managed to get an education, a good education, even though they were from a lower social class. Most of them were from the upper classes. And the idea of the society was to have a place where women could talk about literature and the arts and those kinds of things. Don't quite know where the name Bluestocking came from, but that was the idea, that was the aim of it. And men were also invited along. It wasn't just for women. And when we look back at early feminism and things like that, we can see that quite a lot of the women who started to think about not just women's rights, but a lot of the the idea of Jean King's actually came from these women's groups. Okay, they were interested in charity, they were interested in changing society in various ways. They weren't supposed to be political initially, but they became more political. We've got the original members here. Okay, Elizabeth Montague was a founding member, and Elizabeth Vesey. These two people were the kind of central force. They got it started. Elizabeth Montague was, let's look at their backgrounds. She was married to a wealthy owner of coal mines, which meant, of course, that children were working in those coal mines, people were working in very bad conditions and so on, but she was the wife. She gave a charity to the coal miners at the same time as being rich because of their work. Okay, they would work very hard, and her husband would get all the money, and she would live in that big house and live in all that privilege. At the same time, she would go around on a Sunday morning, giving them little presents to make sure that they had enough food, and talking to the children, and seeing anybody who was sick, and trying to make sure that the conditions of their life were reasonable. Okay, so that's the kind of person that she was. She was good at business herself, and when her husband died, she took over the business, and it grew after his death. So she actually was an example of quite a powerful woman in the 18th century. She was a businesswoman herself. And she was generous but controlling. Okay? She would be kind to those coal miners, but she would be the boss. And she was the same with her friends. She would be generous to people, but she would expect them to kind of obey her. She was a kind of rather controlling sort of person. So you've got two sides here. Kind, but also controlling. Elizabeth Vesey was a very intelligent, very socially active woman, and she was the daughter of an Anglo-Irish bishop. Slightly unusual. The Irish were very often kind of looked down on, but she was successful in London despite her Irish father. But he was Anglo-Irish. It gave him a little bit of status. He was connected with the English Protestant community. And then we got another member, Frances Boscawen. She joined this society, and she became a kind of major hostess for the meetings that the Bluestocking Society had. So these three people were the kind of centre of quite an important group of women in the 18th century. So, I don't suppose they had their own Facebook page, but let's give them a Facebook page. Let's imagine if they had a Facebook page, what it would be like, okay? Elizabeth Vesey, okay? She might have several hundred friends, and yeah, I suppose her Facebook page might have looked a little bit like that. If we click on her friends, we might get to see the kind of people that she mixed with, and this is what's going to be interesting here. I'm just looking at her male friends. I'm not picking out the women here. I'm just picking out some of the men. These are some of the most important men of the 18th century. Okay, this was not just a group of women who were isolated or separate or on their own. She was connected with some very, very important people. Edmund Burke, Member of Parliament, David Garrick, the most famous actor of his day, Thomas Percy, the ballad collector, Richard Sheridan, a famous playwright. His play The Rivals is still famous, even today. Edward Gibbon, Gibbon's History of the Roman Empire is still a classic, 200 years later, more than 200 years later. Samuel Johnson is probably the #1 most famous person of the 18th century in literature, art, everything. Not so much because of what he did, but because of who he knew. He knew everybody, all right? And he was socially connected with everybody. Samuel Johnson was huge in the 18th century, all right? And his connections, he was very, very well connected. Joshua Reynolds, if you know anything about English art, you'll know that Joshua Reynolds is one of the most famous painters of that period. Adam Smith's Political Economy, again, it's the basis for political economy. If you were studying political economy at university today, this is one of the starting points, one of the big important starting points would be Adam Smith. These are big people, all right? So the Bluestockings were very much connected with the important male society. These men all went to those Bluestocking meetings, at least sometimes. All right? So it kind of challenges the idea that we have that women were kind of nothing in those days. Here we've got a group of women who got together and they're very closely connected with some very, very important men in their society at that time. So I think it's worth noticing. All right, a highly influential politician, a very, very popular actor, one of the influences on the Romantic poets through his collection of ballads, very successful satirical dramatist. The History of Rome, Edward Gibbon, and Samuel Johnson, just incredibly famous. And Joshua Reynolds, very famous artist, and Adam Smith, basically the founder of modern economics. So, all right. Not just an isolated group of women, but highly connected with a number of very important men. So, as I say, that goes against our usual understanding of the women in the 18th century. And then the Bluestocking Society itself, imagine it had a Facebook page. It might look something like this, okay? And if we look at some of the eminent members and associates, if you just went and checked through that list, you'd find many influential people, male and female. Okay, I've got men and women in there. Some of them very important people of the 18th century. So the Bluestocking Society was really quite a central part of the social and intellectual life and artistic life of London in the second half of the 18th century. Okay, this list here is particularly, if you'd like to take a look at it sometime, you might want to check out some of these people. Hello? What's happening? So yeah, what I'm saying here is that women were getting more and more accepted in the public sphere. They could join in with the life of people like Samuel Johnson and famous politicians like Hugh Walpole and other very influential men of the day. I'm not saying they were on quite an equal position with those men, but they were able to join in in their intellectual life to some extent. But this was an elite circle. This wasn't what life was like for most women. Most women didn't really have any contact with something like the blue stocking society or that kind of life. And their lives were not going to change very much during the 18th century. And politics was the one topic that women were not supposed to talk about. So at least at the beginning of the blue stocking period, politics was kind of taboo. They weren't supposed to talk about politics. But as they developed, politics became more and more part of the agenda. And they were involved in social reform in various ways. So the blue stocking movement was not just an early kind of slightly, well, to a certain extent, feminist movement. We'll think about it from a feminist point of view, but it was also a socially reformist movement, and there wasn't much social reform in the 18th century. So they stand out from that point of view. Take Hannah More. Okay, she was campaigning against the slave trade many years before it became illegal. And if it hadn't been for people like her pushing, the slave trade would not have been made illegal when it was. Okay, it's because people like her were pushing for many years. And she wrote a lot of moral and religious tracts for distribution among the poor to give them a sort of message for a better life. And she opened schools for the education of the poor. So she's doing a lot of social work. She's not just thinking about being an intellectual woman inside a little group. She's thinking about her society and ways of making life better for some of the people in her society. So she's engaged in social reform of various kinds. She was basically conservative, and she was not trying to be radical. She's not trying to say, let's change society, let's challenge society. She wanted non-radical reform. Most of these conservative blue stockings and people of this period, very often they're quite strongly Christian. Okay, Christianity is generally a conservative kind of force in 18th century England. So it's saying, look, have a Christian education, and rich people can do their duty to the poor by giving them charity and so on. So it's quite strongly based on Christian ideas. But here are some of the books that she wrote. A Good Mother's Legacy, all right? How to be a good mother and what the reward of being a good mother will be. Remember, very socially important because of all those babies that were given into the hospital, you know, and whose mothers weren't looking after them. The Beggarly Boy, all right? How does the beggarly boy, poor boy growing up in the streets like that, is he going to become a good person? How will he become a good person? How will he be saved? The Sorrows of Yanda, a slave woman, all right? How is this woman's life? How should we understand her life, and how can she be saved from her terrible life of slavery? And so on. Sinful Sally, the story of Sinful Sally. She wrote dozens of these, The Touchstone, or The Way to Know a True Christian. She wrote dozens of these things. There's an online collection which you can see if you're interested in these chapbooks. You can go to the McGill Library online, and you can find 100 of her cheap repository tracts, along with other kind of publications of that period, of that kind, that they've collected. They made a big collection. You can just see them all online. So if you're interested in this particular topic, there's a lot of it on the internet, and the McGill Library has a very good collection. You see, a lot of the publications that you got at that time were kind of for all those people who were going out and drinking and having a good time and a party and everything. And there were a lot of publications that were really kind of gehin, okay? Bawdy, rude, a bit sexy, and she's trying to write, let's give the poor people something a little bit better than that. Okay, why do they always have to have this kind of gehin, low-life kind of stuff? But let's take a look at the kind of low-life stuff that she was trying to challenge and give poor people something a little bit better than that. This is an example, the Ballad of the Wooden-Legged Parson. This is a typical thing. The parson, who is, Kyokai no Shimpusama mitai, okay, he's a parson, he's like a kind of Shimpusama. And he makes love to the wife of a barber. So it's a sort of, a kind of sexy sort of story. The barber basically regrets marrying his wife, so he's asking the parson to undo his marriage. Okay, you made my marriage. You said, I pronounce you man and wife. You may kiss the bride. Can you now undo it? Can you separate us, please? Okay, I don't want this wife anymore. So the parson says, okay, I'll see what I can do. And he goes home, and the parson is making love with his wife. Okay? When he gets home, he finds the parson is already there and is sleeping with his wife, or having sex with his wife. And the parson says, well, you are now undone. In that case, meaning you are now made a fool of. You are now, I've undone. You asked to be undone. You're undone now. I've slept with your wife. Hey, okay? It's supposed to be a joke. Okay, I'm sorry. I notice you're not all laughing. You probably don't get it, really. It's an 18th century joke, okay? It's not terribly funny anyway. But the idea is it's a kind of wordplay on undone. You are undone. I've slept with your wife, okay? So that kind of thing. He, of course, the barber kicks the parson out. The parson has a wooden leg, remember. The parson is a wooden-legged parson. He's got a wooden leg, okay? So he kicks the parson out, and he says, oh, let's try again, to his wife. Let's be close. Let's be a good husband and wife to each other. And so he's together with his wife, and he's happy. But the story doesn't end there, because 9 months later, his wife has a baby, and the baby's born with a wooden leg. Okay, all right, 18th century humour. Not terribly funny, really. Okay, but that you can read. I put it on your print page. You can read it there if you want to. All right, that's the story of the wooden-legged parson. All right. Okay. And that was the kind of thing that was typical for poor people. That was the kind of publication they typically got. Yes. Has anybody else not got the second print? みんな2番目のプリント持ってない。それも忘れてきましたか? Oh, sugar puffs. I left them in my office. Okay, I'll bring them to you next week. Okay, all right. Sorry. I'm sorry. On that second print, you'll find the complete. I'm sorry, I wasn't very awake this morning. So I'll bring those for you next week. Okay, or you can come to my office straight away if you want. They're just sitting up there. But I won't go and get them now because otherwise we'll lose the class time. There were loads of these kinds of publications. Okay, well, I guess today then, since you can't fill in the print, just relax and watch the. Okay, I'll put it all up on the web page later on anyway. But okay, that's a typical sort of thing, and there were lots and lots of publications like that. And notice that the woman is the sexual opportunist. She's the active one. She's the one who, the pastor goes around and says, "I've come to undo your marriage with your husband." She'll undo it, yeah. Okay, let's go to bed together. She's the active one. And this is very typical in part of the early modern 16th, 17th. It was the woman who was you've got to be careful of women. That's a basic sort of sexist message. Okay, men kind of feared women. Women were seen as being using their sexuality to get what they want. All right. One of the famous texts for that is Moll Flanders, and John Cleland's Memoirs of a Woman of Pleasure is basically the first pornographic novel, popularly known as Fanny Hill. And in both cases, the woman gets what she wants, and she uses her sex to get it. All right. In both cases, well, particularly John Cleland's Memoirs of a Woman of Pleasure basically just means a Baishung, a prostitute. Okay. Moll Flanders is not exactly a prostitute, but she has 5 different husbands, and she's always looking for which one is rich. Okay. She's always trying to use her sexuality to attract men and to get money. And this is typical. Women were seen one way or another. They were seen through their sexuality. It was the sexuality that made a woman attractive or unattractive. The basic quality of a woman was her sexuality. That's okay. That's what feminism was all about. The feminism movement is about saying women are not just sexual objects. Women have minds and feelings, and women have, just like men. Okay, so the whole thinking in the 18th century was the only important thing about a woman is her sex. Nothing else really matters. Okay, well, the blue stockings are challenging that. They're saying, no, we have brains as well. Okay, and we have policies and actions, and we have plans, and we have a whole kind of life. All right, we're not just we're not just our sex. So the blue stockings were attacked by some people. Byron, for example, the Romantic poet, wrote a lot about the blue stockings, making fun of them and commenting on them in his poetry. "Oh, ye lords of ladies intellectual, inform us truly, have they not henpecked you all?" To henpeck is shirini hikaru. Okay, so isn't that what they do to you? These clever women, don't they just henpeck you? Don't they control you? Isn't that what really this is happening? That the woman becomes the boss. Okay. So an intellectual woman, we don't want clever women because they'll start pushing us men around. Keep them stupid. Okay, so even a famous Romantic poet, Byron, has that way of thinking. He doesn't want clever women. All right, so you can see the blue stockings cause quite a lot of negative reaction at the time. And here's an example of the sort of, here's another parson with a blue stocking lady. You can see the expression on her face, and you can see where he's put his foot and where she's got hers. Okay, they're playing footsies. Okay, which is a sort of prelude to sexual activity. He's put his foot up against her leg, and she's, "Oh, sir." Okay, so. Again, it brings it back to sex, doesn't it? So you get these negative responses, which are a sign of male anxiety about women who are moving into territory that was basically considered to be male territory. Women moving into art, politics, intellectual areas, and men feeling, "Oh God, the women coming into my area." It was fairly conservative over the general kind of spectrum of its activities, but it did create a space for intellectual women to take their place alongside men. So it was, to a certain extent, challenging the society of men. Here we get a social gathering in 1778. Here is Elizabeth Carter, a woman, an intelligent woman of that time. She's talking about what it's like when you go to a gathering, a social gathering. There are men and there are women, and this is what happens. As if the two sexes had been in a state of war, the gentlemen arranged themselves on one side of the room, where they talked about their own talk and left us poor ladies to twirl our shuttles and muse each other by conversing as we could. By what little I could overhear, our opposites, the men, were discussing Old English poets, and this subject did not seem so much beyond a female capacity, but that we might have been indulged with a share of it. I know about the Old English poets. I could have joined the men and talked about it, but no, you're a woman. You can't join us. We're talking about men's things. We're talking about poetry. I know about poetry, but you're a woman. Okay, so this was what life was like in the 18th century. The women were typically kept separate from the men and expected to talk about little things like the next coffee party or the next little dance or something like that. So the Bluestockings managed to challenge a lot of that. For example, Catherine Macaulay was a historian, and her history was a very good history, very well-respected history. But, you see, she took the side of Oliver Cromwell, who chopped the king's head off. She took the side of challenging the society. She dared to say that it was fine to kill a king. She dared to say it was fine to establish a democratic republic, like Oliver Cromwell did. It was fine to extend the franchise to those who work to buy their bread. That people who work should be able to vote. Okay, she's campaigning. She's saying, yes, those people who work, they should be able to get the vote as well. All right. So the colonies, as you know, America became independent. She supported America. Yes, become independent. Choose your own life. Follow your own way. Don't feel you have to be part of Britain and its empire. So she's challenging in a political way through her writing about history. So we've got powerful women beginning to challenge the masculine world of politics and social control. If you want to find out a bit more about the Bluestockings, I give you references on the print when you get it next week, or I'll put them up on. I'm sorry that I messed up on the last print today, but I'll give you those references. I'll put them up on the web page, or you can get them probably next week. Okay, but I think yes, if you're studying the 18th century, the Bluestockings is one of the things that you ought to know about. Okay, so you can do a bit of your own work by going to I think that book, Reconsidering the Bluestockings, you can find it on Google Books. You should be able to access that chapter. Okay, if you can't, well, I might find some way that you can get hold of it. Okay, but yeah, I think especially if you're interested in the history of women during this period, the Bluestockings is a kind of central topic. Okay, and that's what I've tried to cover today. And that's it. I'm going to shut up because I think I've said everything. All right. So basically, that's the end for today. Okay.